"I'm not hurt, coach. I'm fine. Please don't call anyone." Those 7 words. That's what broke Brian Matthews open. Not the limp, not the bruises, not even the way a 15-year-old boy flinched every single time someone walked too close behind him. It was the pleading in his eyes, the kind of desperate, hollow begging that doesn't come from pain. It comes from terror. If this story already has you leaning forward, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Every word of this matters. Brian Matthews had been coaching football at Oak Creek High for 11 years. He had seen pulled hamstrings, stress fractures, shoulder separations, and one truly unforgettable moment where a kid named Davey Kowalski somehow managed to sprain both ankles at the same time, running a straight line. He had seen it all, or so he told himself every September when the new season started, and a fresh batch of boys came thundering onto his field like they owned the whole state of Ohio. He thought he knew what injury looked like. He did not know what Cody Sullivan looked like. Not yet. The first time Brian noticed the limp, it was a Tuesday. 3rd week of October. Practice had barely started, the air still carrying that sharp bite that comes before the first real freeze, and the team was running basic conditioning drills. Nothing brutal, nothing that should have slowed anyone down. Brian was standing near the 40-yard line with his clipboard watching the defensive line run routes when something in his peripheral vision caught him wrong. A stumble, a catch, a recovery so practiced it looked almost automatic. He turned. Cody Sullivan, number 32. Sophomore, one of the hardest working kids on the junior varsity roster, was jogging at about 70%, his right leg moving with this subtle but unmistakable hitch on every 4th or 5th stride. Like something inside the joint was grinding that shouldn't be grinding. Like he was navigating around a pain he'd gotten very good at hiding. Brian watched him for another 30 seconds. Then he walked over. "Sullivan, hold up." Cody stopped, turned around. And there it was, the first thing Brian would later remember as the moment he should have known. The boy's face did something strange. For just a split second before the neutral expression locked into place, there was this flicker of something that wasn't pain and wasn't embarrassment. It was something closer to calculation. Like he was already running through what to say before Brian had even said anything. "Yeah, coach, you're favoring that right leg. What happened?" "Nothing. Tweaked it in practice last week. It's almost gone." Brian looked at him. 11 years of watching teenagers lie to his face about grades, about curfews, about whether they'd done their conditioning homework had given him a reasonably reliable internal alarm system. Right now, that alarm was making noise. "Let me see you walk to the end zone and back." Cody walked, smooth, deliberate, controlled, like a kid who had specifically rehearsed what walking without a limp looked like. It was almost convincing. Almost. "You're compensating with your hip," Brian said. "That's not a tweak. Come see me after practice. We'll have Donahue look at it." Something shifted in Cody's face. "Coach, really, After practice, Sullivan. That's not a request." And Cody nodded, because what else could he do? He nodded and jogged back to the drill line, and Brian watched him go, and the alarm inside his chest kept ringing. After practice, Cody did not come to see him. Brian found this out 20 minutes later when he went looking and discovered that Cody Sullivan had apparently evaporated. His locker was open. His street clothes were gone. One of the other sophomores, a kid named Marcus, who played center and had the situational awareness of a golden retriever, told Brian he'd seen Cody leave out the side door during the equipment cooldown. "He was moving fast," Marcus added helpfully. "Like real fast, for somebody who was limping." Brian stood in the empty locker room for a moment. He looked at Cody's open locker jersey, hung up neat shoulder pads, perfectly aligned, everything in its exact right place, with the kind of compulsive orderliness that either meant a very organized kid or a kid who had learned that being invisible was the safest way to exist. He told himself it wasn't a big deal. He'd talk to him tomorrow. He went home. He ate dinner. He watched the news. And at 11:30 at night, he was still sitting in his living room, not sleeping, thinking about that flicker on a 15-year-old's face. Wednesday was worse. Brian was watching from across the practice field when Cody came out of the school building and started across the parking lot toward the field entrance. Two senior boys were coming from the opposite direction. Big kids varsity players. The kind of broad-shouldered confidence that only comes from never having been told no in your entire life. Brian didn't think anything of it at first. Just movement. Just geometry. Then he watched Cody see them. The boy didn't stop walking. He didn't run. He didn't do anything dramatic or obvious. But his whole body did something in that moment, a kind of internal reorganization, a pulling inward, a tightening that started at his shoulders and traveled all the way down to his feet. He altered his path, 4 degrees to the left, enough to widen the gap between himself and those two seniors by maybe 8 feet. 8 feet, like it was the difference between safety and something else. The two seniors glanced at him. One of them said something. Brian was too far away to hear it. But he saw the grin. Slow, wide. The kind of grin that isn't friendly. The kind of grin that's a reminder. Cody kept walking, eyes forward, face blank. He reached the field and started stretching like nothing had happened. Methodical, quiet, alone in a crowd of 30 boys. Brian looked back at the two seniors. He didn't know their names yet. He would soon enough. That afternoon, he pulled Marcus aside because Marcus, for all his situational obliviousness, had the unique quality of having no filter whatsoever between his brain and his mouth. "Marcus, those two big seniors, the ones who came through the east parking lot today around 3:15. You know who they are?" Marcus blinked. "Which one's the big guys? That's Trent Harris and Weston Cole. They're on varsity." He said it the way you'd say the names of weather systems. Just facts. Just things that existed in the world. Good players. I mean, yeah, Trent's dad basically funded the new weight room, so... He shrugged with the particular eloquence of a 14-year-old who understood the politics of his environment perfectly and had simply decided not to think about them. Brian nodded slowly. "Okay, thanks, Marcus." "Is Cody in trouble?" Brian stopped, looked at him. "Why do you ask that?" Marcus shrugged again. "I don't know. He always looks like he's in trouble. Like not the regular kind. The quiet kind." He seemed surprised by his own observation. "I don't know. Forget it, coach. Sorry." Brian did not forget it. Thursday morning before first period, Brian went to see the school trainer. A round, good-natured man named Phil Donahue, who had been patching up Oak Creek athletes for 15 years and had the filing system of a hurricane but the memory of a steel trap. "Cody Sullivan," Brian said, leaning in the doorway. "Sophomore, number 32 JV. Has he been in to see you?" Phil swiveled in his chair, tapped his chin. "Sullivan? Sullivan." He rolled to his cabinet, flipped through folders, came back. "Nope, not this season. Actually not at all. I don't have any record of him coming in. He's been limping for at least 2 weeks. And he hasn't been in to see me." Phil said it as a statement, but his eyebrows were asking a question. "No." Phil was quiet for a moment. "When you spend 15 years in a school trainer's office, you develop your own version of an alarm system." Brian could see Phil's going off right now. That's a little unusual for a kid with a persistent injury. Most of them come in at least once, if only to get out of running the mile." "Yeah," Brian said. "That's what I thought. He left the trainer's office and walked slowly down the hallway toward his first class. Around him, the school was doing its normal morning thing. Lockers, slamming sneakers, squeaking voices, overlapping into that specific kind of controlled chaos that sounds like disorder, but is actually a very precise social ecosystem. He saw Cody Sullivan at his locker. The boy was getting his books out with his back to the hallway, and for a moment, Brian almost kept walking, almost decided to handle this the normal way, through proper channels. Speak to the guidance counselor, fill out the right forms, follow the procedure. Then, he saw Cody's hands. The right sleeve of his hoodie had ridden up 2 inches when he reached for a textbook on the top shelf. Just 2 inches. Just for a second. And in that 2-inch gap, Brian Matthews saw a bruise that was absolutely unambiguously without any possible athletic explanation, the shape of a handprint. He stopped walking. He stood there in the middle of the hallway and he stopped walking. Cody pulled his sleeve down, got his textbook, closed the locker, turned around and saw Brian standing there 6 feet away with an expression on his face that he apparently could not entirely control because Cody Sullivan went very, very still. "My office," Brian said quietly. "Right now, please." It wasn't a question, but he said please because the boy needed to know this wasn't punishment. He needed to know this was something different. Cody came. They sat across from each other in Brian's small office off the gymnasium, the one that smelled permanently of whiteboard marker and old coffee and the particular brand of anxiety that comes with pre-game talks. Brian closed the door, sat down, looked at the 15-year-old in front of him, who was sitting with his back straight and his hands folded in his lap and his face arranged into an expression of careful, practiced calm. "How long?" Brian asked. Cody blinked. "How long what?" "Don't." Brian's voice was quiet. Not angry, just done with going around it. "I saw your arm. I've been watching you all week. The limp. The way you moved around Harris and Cole in the parking lot yesterday. The fact that you won't go near Phil Donahue." He paused. Let the silence sit. "How long?" Something happened in Cody's face. Not a crack, more like a hairline fracture. Small, barely visible. But it was there. "Coach, I'm not sending you to the principal's office. I'm not calling your caseworker. I just need to know the truth. How long has this been happening?" Cody looked at his hands, looked at the wall, looked at the corner of Brian's desk where a small ceramic mug that said "World's Okayest Coach" sat next to a stack of play diagrams. He looked at everything in the room except Brian Matthews. And then very quietly he said, "Since September. September. 7 weeks." Brian kept his face even. "Trent and Weston." A muscle in Cody's jaw jumped. That was confirmation enough. "They take money from you." Nothing. Then a tiny, almost invisible nod. "And when you don't have it?" The silence that followed that question was the loudest thing Brian had heard in years. "Cody." He leaned forward. "I need you to hear me. What I just saw on your arm, that is not something that's your fault. That is not something you deserve. And it's not something you have to keep carrying by yourself. Okay, I need you to hear that." Cody looked at him then. Really looked at him. And what Brian saw in the boy's eyes was not relief. It was not gratitude. What he saw was the careful, exhausted calculation of someone who had been let down so many times that hope itself had become a risk he didn't know if he could afford. "Coach, if you report it, they'll know I told. And their families." He stopped. Started again. "You don't understand how this school works. Their dads are on the school board. Trent's dad gave the district like $200,000 for the gym renovation. Nobody is going to—" "I know how the school works," Brian interrupted. His voice was steady because he needed it to be steady. "I've been here 11 years. I know exactly how it works. And I'm not going to sit here and promise you that going to Principal Morrison is going to fix anything, because I'm not sure it will." He watched the boy absorb that. Honest. He had to be honest. "But I'm also not going to pretend I didn't see what I saw. So here's what I need from you. I need your emergency contact." Cody frowned. "What, why?" "Because you're a 15-year-old kid in the foster system, which means you have an emergency contact on file and that person deserves to know what's happening." "There's nobody," Cody started. "Your file says there is. Brother, Jackson Sullivan." The change that moved through Cody Sullivan's body at the sound of that name was unlike anything Brian had expected. It wasn't hope. It wasn't relief. It was something far more complicated, a mixture of longing and fear, and something that looked almost like grief, all tangled up together in the span of about 3 seconds. "You can't call Jackson," Cody said, quietly, with a conviction that was completely out of proportion to the words themselves. "Why not?" "Because—" Cody stopped. His jaw was tight. His hands, Brian noticed, had curled slightly in his lap. Because he's trying to build a life. He's doing better. He doesn't need me pulling him back into something. Into what? Into my mess. The two words landed like stones. Brian looked at him for a long moment. Cody, what kind of person is your brother? And Cody Sullivan, 15 years old, sitting in a coach's office with a handprint bruise under his sleeve and 7 weeks of violence lodged somewhere inside his chest, did something that Brian did not expect. He almost smiled. Just for a second. The way you smile when something is both wonderful and devastating at the same time. He's the kind of person, Cody said very slowly, who fixes things. Then I'm calling him. Coach, I'm calling him. Brian's voice was not loud. It was not aggressive. It was simply completely certain. Not because I'm going to blow up your life or his, because you are sitting in front of me with injuries that should have had you in the ER, and you have been carrying this completely alone for 7 weeks, and whatever your brother is building his life, his future, whatever it is, I guarantee you, Cody, I guarantee you that he would want to know about this. People who love you want to know when you're drowning. The room was very quiet. Outside somewhere down the hall, a locker slammed. Voices rose and fell. The world continued its normal operations, completely indifferent. Inside, a 15-year-old boy looked at the man sitting across from him, and he did not argue. He did not fight. He did not run. He just exhaled. A long, slow, shuddering exhale that sounded like something being set down after being carried for a very, very long time. And he gave Brian the number. Brian waited until his lunch break, sat alone in his office with the door closed and the number on a piece of paper in front of him. He looked at it for a while. Not because he was uncertain, because he understood on some instinctive level that this phone call was going to be a before and after moment. That whatever existed on the other side of dialing those digits was going to change the shape of the next several days in ways he couldn't fully predict. He dialed. It rang 3 times, 4, then 5, and Brian started composing a voicemail in his head, and someone picked up. The background noise was immediate and overwhelming. Engines' bass-heavy music voices, overlapping the particular acoustic chaos of a large indoor space, with no carpeting and too many hard surfaces. Then, a voice cut through all of it like a blade through water. Low, even. The voice of someone who had learned a long time ago that volume is the tool of people who aren't actually confident. Yeah, not hello, not who is this, just yeah. Like he'd been expecting a call, like he was always expecting a call. Brian cleared his throat. Is this Jackson Sullivan? A pause, short, just one beat. Who's asking? My name is Brian Matthews. I'm the football coach at Oak Creek High School in Millfield, Ohio. I have your brother Cody in my office. The music in the background dropped. Not all the way, but enough. Like someone had just turned the volume down without being asked. Is he hurt? Direct. No preamble. No what's going on, or how did you get this number? Just the only thing that mattered. Yes, Brian said, because lying would have been a waste of both their time. Not in a way that's immediately life-threatening, but yes, he's been hurt, repeatedly, by other students, for approximately 7 weeks. The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 4 seconds. Brian counted them. Because in those 4 seconds he heard something change in the quality of that silence, a kind of pressurization, like the moment before a storm system arrives, and the air itself goes tight and strange. 7 weeks. Jackson Sullivan said. His voice had not gotten louder. It had gotten quieter, which was somehow much, much worse. And he's been going to school every day for 7 weeks. Yes, and nobody... A pause. Brief, controlled. Nobody stopped it. No. Another silence. This one felt like a decision being made. What's your name again? Jackson asked. Brian Matthews. Okay, Brian Matthews. Something in the way he said it like he was logging the name somewhere permanent. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to keep my brother in your sight. You're not going to send him back into that building without you knowing exactly where he is. And I am going to be there." He paused. "Tell me what days he has afternoon practice." "Monday through Thursday, 3 to 5:30. "Today's Thursday." "Yes. I'll be there today." "Not I'll try or I'll see what I can do. No qualifiers, no conditions. Don't let him leave the building before I get there. Can you do that?" Brian thought about his afternoon schedule, his 3 o'clock JV practice, his department meeting at 4:30 that he was already going to miss. "Yes," he said. "I can do that." "Good." A brief pause, and then unexpectedly something shifted in Jackson Sullivan's voice. Just slightly. The blade edge pulled back an inch. "He eating okay, sleeping?" The question was so quiet and so human that it caught Brian completely off guard. I don't know. He seems tired." "Yeah." The word came out like it weighed something. "He would be." Another pause. "Brian?" "Yeah. Thank you for calling me. Seriously." And then before Brian could respond to that, the line clicked dead. Brian sat holding the phone against his ear for a moment, listening to the silence where the voice had been. He looked at the piece of paper with the number on it. He looked at the door of his office. He looked at the play diagrams on the corner of his desk. Then he got up, walked out of his office, and went to find Cody Sullivan. He found him in the cafeteria, sitting at the far end of a table by himself, not dramatically alone, not the movie version of a bullied kid with an empty tray surrounded by laughing tormentors. Just quietly, practically alone, with a half-eaten sandwich and a textbook open in front of him that he wasn't reading, and earbuds in that were not actually connected to anything. Brian sat down across from him. Cody looked up, saw Brian's face. His own face went very careful. "You called him," Cody said. "I called him." Whatever Cody was feeling in that moment, he kept it internal with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that feelings were a luxury best handled in private. He looked back at his textbook. "What did he say?" "He said he's coming today. He said to keep you in my sight until he gets here." A long pause. Cody's finger moved to a line in the textbook he definitely wasn't reading. "He say anything else?" Brian remembered. "He eating okay. Sleeping. He asked if you were eating and sleeping all right." Something crossed Cody's face so quickly that Brian almost missed it. Something raw and unguarded and deeply painfully young. It was there and gone in less than a second, locked back behind that careful, neutral expression. "That's such a Jackson thing to say," Cody said quietly, not to Brian, to himself. They sat in silence for a moment. Around them, the cafeteria did its thing. Trays clattering, conversations rising and falling, someone laughing too loud near the vending machines. "Coach?" Cody's voice was very low. "When he gets here, it's going to be a lot. Jackson he doesn't do things quietly." "I got that sense," Brian said carefully. Cody stopped. His jaw worked. "I just need you to know that I didn't ask for this. I didn't want anyone to get hurt because of me." Brian looked at him steadily. "Cody, you are 15 years old. The only person who should be worried about getting hurt because of you is you. That is it. That is the only correct version of this situation." Cody said nothing. But he picked up his sandwich and took a bite, and that felt to Brian Matthews like some small and significant thing. The afternoon light was already starting to go gold through the cafeteria windows. Somewhere across town, on a road that was eating up miles with the specific urgency of someone who had gotten very good at going from zero to moving without wasting time, in between a black Harley, was heading toward Oak Creek High School. Cody Sullivan looked at the door of the cafeteria, then at his textbook, then at his hands. He did not know what was coming, but something in his body, some deep animal, exhausted part of him that had been standing guard for 7 weeks without rest, had already started very slowly to lower its defenses. Like it knew, like it had always known, that some things in this world are worth trusting. The afternoon went quiet in the way that bad afternoons always do, not peacefully, but with that specific held-breath stillness that settles over a place right before something breaks. Brian kept his word. He stayed close to Cody through the rest of the school day, not hovering, not making it obvious, but close enough that when the final bell rang at 2:50 and the hallways exploded with the usual end-of-day chaos, he was positioned near Cody's locker, pretending to review a clipboard of practice notes while actually watching the hallway with the focused attention of a man who had made a promise to a stranger on a phone and intended to keep it. Cody moved through the crowded hallway like he always did, low profile, measured, taking up as little space as possible. He'd gotten so good at it that most kids didn't even register him. That invisibility was the thing that had been protecting him, and it was also the thing that had allowed this to go on for 7 weeks without anyone seeing it clearly. Brian was beginning to understand just how deliberate that invisibility was. This wasn't a shy kid or an introverted kid. This was a trained kid. A kid who had learned through repeated and painful instruction that being noticed was dangerous. He was putting his books away when Trent Harris appeared at the end of the hallway. Brian saw it happen in real time, and it was one of the most quietly disturbing things he'd witnessed in 11 years of working with teenagers. Trent didn't do anything obvious. He didn't walk toward Cody or say anything or make any threatening gesture. He just appeared, stopped walking, stood there at maybe 30 feet of distance with his arms crossed and his eyes on Cody's back, and he smiled. That same slow, wide reminder of a smile that Brian had seen in the parking lot the day before. Cody felt it. Brian watched the boy's shoulders stiffen incrementally, the way a deer stiffens when it scents something in the wind before it can see what's there. He didn't turn around. He just got slower, more deliberate, like he was calculating. Brian stepped forward, deliberately placed himself in Trent Harris's line of sight, made full direct eye contact, and held it. Trent blinked. His smile didn't disappear, but it recalibrated, became less comfortable, more questioning. He looked at Brian with the mild irritation of someone who wasn't used to being interrupted, then looked back at Cody, then back at Brian. Then he unfolded his arms, turned and walked the other direction. Cody exhaled. A small, almost imperceptible breath. "He's gone," Brian said quietly, coming up beside him. "I know." Cody closed his locker. His face was still that careful blank, but his hands were doing something small and involuntary, pressing against his thighs like he needed something solid to push against. "He does that. He doesn't always have to actually touch you. Sometimes just letting you know he sees you is the whole point." Brian absorbed that, filed it away in the part of his brain that was now running a very different calculation than the one he'd started the day with. "Come on. Practice starts in 10. You're staying on the field where I can see you." Cody almost said something. Brian could see it in his face, some version of, "I'm fine," or "You don't have to," or "This is embarrassing." But he swallowed it, nodded, picked up his bag and followed. That small cooperation felt enormous. Practice started. The JV team went through warm-ups and Brian ran drills and called corrections and did all the normal things a football coach does on a Thursday afternoon. And the whole time, one part of his brain was completely occupied with the sound of the road and the math of the drive and where exactly a black Harley was on its way from and how long it was going to take. Cody ran drills. He wasn't at full capacity. That right leg was still compromised, still hitching on the harder cuts. But he ran. He moved. He participated with a kind of grim, determined professionalism that Brian was simultaneously awed by and horrified at, because that level of pain tolerance in a 15-year-old was not a strength. It was evidence of something that should never have been allowed to become necessary. 30 minutes into practice, Marcus jogged up beside Brian during a water break and said without any particular preamble, "Hey, Coach, there's a motorcycle in the front lot that I don't think is a teacher's." Brian looked up from his clipboard. "What kind?" "The kind that's really loud," Marcus said earnestly. Like we could hear it from the backfield. It kind of sounded like thunder, but angrier. Brian lowered his clipboard, looked at the field, looked at Cody, who was standing with his water bottle halfway to his mouth, and his eyes fixed on the building entrance, with an expression that was impossible to fully read, some mixture of relief and dread, and something else, something deeper and older, that had nothing to do with today. "Take over warm-down drills," Brian said to his assistant, and he was already walking. He heard it before he saw it. Even parked and silent, there was something about that motorcycle, the sheer physical presence of it, the way it occupied space that announced itself. And next to it, leaning against the front of the school building with his arms crossed and his eyes doing a slow, methodical sweep of everything in his field of vision, was Jackson Sullivan. Brian had not known what to expect. He'd built some version of an image from the voice on the phone, the low certainty of it, the controlled stillness, the way every word had been placed with precision. But the man standing against the school wall was still somehow more than that image. He was big. Not in the flashy weight room way of the varsity players Brian coached, bigger in a structural way, the way certain men are built, who have done real physical work for real lengths of time. He had dark hair and forearms covered in ink that started at his wrists and disappeared under rolled-up sleeves, and he was wearing riding gear with the ease of someone who wore it like other people wore skin. There was no aggression in his posture, no performance. He was just there, completely, unmistakably, unavoidably there, with the kind of grounded stillness that doesn't need to announce itself because it fills a space whether it wants to or not. He looked at Brian when Brian approached. Not suspicious, not hostile, evaluating. The way you look at someone when you're deciding quickly whether they're going to be useful. "Brian Matthews," he said. "Jackson Sullivan." They didn't shake hands. There wasn't time for it. Both of them felt that immediately, the mutual sense that they were past introduction and into something more operational. "Where is he?" Jackson asked. "Backfield. Practice." "He know I'm here. He figured it out when he heard the bike." Something moved across Jackson's face at that brief and unguarded, almost like a wince. "Yeah, he would." He pushed off the wall. "Show me." They walked around the side of the building together, and Brian was aware in a way he couldn't entirely explain that this man beside him was running multiple calculations at once, taking in the layout of the building, the exits, the positions of students still milling around the campus, the distance from where they were to where Cody was. Not paranoid, not anxious, just thorough. The way someone is thorough when thoroughness has kept them alive. "How bad?" Jackson asked without looking at Brian. Brian didn't insult him by softening it. Boot-shaped bruising on his thigh, handprint bruise on his forearm. He's been limping for at least 2 weeks and avoiding the trainer. He's been paying them. When he doesn't have enough money. He stopped. "They collect differently," Jackson finished. Flat. A statement of fact with a specific kind of fury underneath it that was all the more dangerous for being so completely controlled. Yes. A silence. They turned the corner and the backfield came into view. 30 boys running cool-down drills in the fading afternoon light, and one of them, number 32, broke from the group the second Jackson came into his line of sight. Not dramatically. Not running. Just stopped. Stood completely still. Jackson stopped walking too. Across 60 feet of grass, the two brothers looked at each other. Brian stayed where he was and watched it happen. And he felt the peculiar privilege of witnessing something private, the way two people who have been separated by time and distance and circumstances that were never in their control can look at each other and have an entire conversation in the space of 3 seconds without saying a single word. Then Cody walked toward Jackson, and Jackson walked toward Cody, and when they met in the middle, Jackson did something Brian didn't expect. He didn't make it dramatic. He just put one hand on the back of Cody's head and pulled him forward and held him there for a moment, forehead to shoulder, one big hand on the back of a 15-year-old's skull, with the careful, deliberate tenderness of someone who had learned a long time ago that tenderness is something you have to be intentional about, because the world will not be intentional about it for you. Cody didn't make a sound, but his hands came up and gripped the front of Jackson's jacket, and his knuckles went white, and Brian quietly turned and looked at the practice field, so the boy could have that moment without an audience. Marcus appeared at his elbow. "Coach," he whispered with the reverence of someone who understood he was watching something significant, even if he couldn't name exactly what. Is that his brother?" "Yeah," Brian said. Marcus looked at Jackson Sullivan for a long moment. "Cool. he whispered with the profound sincerity of a 14-year-old who meant it completely. When Brian turned back, they had separated. Jackson had his hands on Cody's shoulders, and he was looking at him. Really looking the way you look at someone when you're cataloging damage and trying not to show how much that damage is affecting you. "Let me see your arm," Jackson said quietly. Cody hesitated. "Jack, let me see it, Code." Slowly, Cody pushed up his sleeve. Jackson looked at the bruise for exactly 2 seconds. His jaw went tight. He pulled the sleeve back down with the same gentleness he might use handling something fragile. His face was controlled, completely controlled. But his eyes had gone somewhere very flat and very still, and Brian recognized that kind of stillness. He'd seen it in men who had learned to put their anger somewhere interior and load-bearing rather than external and explosive. "Okay," Jackson said, quietly, like he was talking to himself as much as to Cody. "Okay. Who are they?" It wasn't a question. Cody looked at him. "Jackson, listen to me. You can't just—" "Who are they, Cody?" "They have their families, have money and connections, and the principal isn't going to—" "I'm not talking about the principal." Jackson's voice was patient, completely terrifyingly patient. "I'm talking about the 2 boys who put a boot print on your leg, their names." The word boot print landed on Brian like something physical because he hadn't mentioned boot-shaped specifically. He'd said boot-shaped bruising, and Jackson had locked onto exactly that detail with the precision of someone who was building a complete picture very, very fast. Cody looked at his brother for a long moment, and then something in his face shifted not toward fear, but away from it. Like he was making a decision. Like he was calculating one final time the cost of telling the truth versus the cost of continuing to carry it, and finally, at long last, arriving at a different answer than the one he'd been living with for 7 weeks. "Trent Harris," he said, "and Weston Cole." Jackson nodded once, like he'd already suspected as much. "Harris, that's the family whose name is on the gym," Brian answered before he thought about it. "Yes, his father is on the school board. He's donated significantly to the district." Jackson looked at him. Something crossed his face, not surprise, something closer to grim recognition. "Of course he is." He straightened, rolled his neck once, a small, deliberate physical reset. "All right, Brian. I need to know who's in that building right now. Specifically, is the principal here?" "At 3:40 on a Thursday, almost certainly. He usually stays until 5. "Harris's father. Does he have a relationship with the principal? Personal, not just financial?" Brian thought about it. He'd seen them together at booster dinners, at board meetings, at the kind of community events that seemed social on the surface, but were actually about maintaining a very specific order of things. Yes, they've been in the same social circles for a long time. Jackson absorbed this. And if someone filed a formal complaint about his son right now tonight, what would happen to it? Brian didn't answer immediately because the answer was ugly, and he was a school employee, and saying it out loud felt like a betrayal of something. But he looked at the bruise he'd seen on Cody's arm, and the boot print he hadn't even known about until 30 seconds ago, and he said, "Honestly, I don't know that it would go anywhere. Not quickly, not without a significant amount of pressure from outside the system." Jackson looked at him for a long moment. "You're an honest man, Brian Matthews," he said. "I appreciate that." He turned back to Cody. "Is either of them on campus right now?" Cody blinked. "Probably. Varsity practice runs until 4:30. "Where?" "East Field, past the gym." Jackson turned and started walking toward the building. "Jackson." Cody's voice went sharp. "Jackson, wait. I'm not going to hurt anyone," Jackson said without turning around. "I'm going to have a conversation. There's a difference. That's not, you don't understand. If you go in there and start something, they're going to call the police and—" Jackson stopped, turned back. And when he looked at Cody, the flatness was still in his eyes, but underneath it was something else now. Something pained and honest and very, very tired. "Cody, listen to me." His voice dropped. "I've been trying to stay out of situations like this for 3 years. You know why." "I know why," So I need you to trust me when I tell you that I know exactly where every line is. I know what I can do, and what I can't do, and what I should do. I didn't drive 4 hours to blow everything up." He held the eye contact. "I drove 4 hours because you are my brother, and somebody hurt you, and I am not going to stand on a football field and do nothing about it. That's not something I'm capable of. Do you understand?" Cody's jaw was tight. His eyes were bright, not with tears, but with something close to it, that particular brightness that comes right before someone decides to trust something they've been afraid to trust. "Yeah," he said. "I understand." "Okay." Jackson looked at Brian. "Walk with me." Brian walked with him. They went into the building through the side entrance by the gymnasium, and the school hallway did what school hallways always do, with an unexpected presence. It registered him. Students moving in both directions slowed almost imperceptibly, then slowed more noticeably, then stopped the way things stop when something enters a space that changes the atmosphere of that space. Not because Jackson did anything, because he didn't have to. He walked with the specific contained energy of a man who had decided something, and was executing that decision and that quality. That absolute absence of hesitation is something that human beings recognize on a biological level before they register it consciously. A junior girl literally walked into a locker. Her friend grabbed her arm and they both stared. Two freshman boys going the opposite direction pressed against the wall without being asked to. Brian walked beside Jackson and watched the hallway rearrange itself, and he thought about what Cody had said. He's the kind of person who fixes things. And he thought about the bruise shaped like a hand on a 15-year-old's arm, and the boot print on his thigh, and 7 weeks of silence, and a school system that had been bought and paid for and was not in any meaningful way oriented toward protecting the right person. He thought whatever happens next, at least something is finally happening. They found Trent Harris coming out of the boys' locker room near the gym. He was with Weston Cole. Of course, he was. They were always together the way that particular kind of person is always together with their particular kind of accomplice. Each one amplifying the other's confidence by being there as an audience, and a backup, and a witness that the other one never has to be alone in anything. Trent saw Jackson first. His stride didn't break immediately. It took about 2 full steps for his brain to catch up with his eyes and register that what he was seeing was not normal, and was not something he knew how to categorize. By step 3, he'd stopped. And the easy, entitled confidence that sat on Trent Harris like a custom-fitted jacket. The confidence that came from 17 years of consequences being redirected away from him by money and influence, and the particular social architecture of a small Ohio town, did something Brian had never seen it do. It flickered, just for a second. Just one small, involuntary flicker. But it was there. Weston Cole, coming out of the locker room half a step behind Trent, looked up, saw Jackson, and went completely still, with the specific frozen quality of an animal that has just realized it is in the presence of something it is not equipped to handle. Jackson stopped walking about 8 feet from them. His hands were at his sides. His voice when he spoke was entirely conversational. "Trent Harris," he said. Trent's chin came up. The reflex was so automatic he probably didn't even know he was doing it, that defensive elevation of the jaw that teenagers use when they're trying to recapture authority they feel slipping. "Who are you?" "My name is Jackson Sullivan," Jackson said. "Cody Sullivan is my brother." He let that sit for exactly 1 beat. "I think you know who Cody is." Something moved through Trent Harris's face. It was not guilt, not exactly, not in the way that guilt looks when it comes from the conscience. It was more like the calculation of risk, the sudden reassessment of a situation that had until approximately 30 seconds ago seemed entirely controlled. "I don't know what he told you." Trent started the words coming out with the practiced smoothness of someone who had talked his way out of things before. "But whatever he said, he didn't tell me anything," Jackson said pleasantly. "Your boot did." Trent stopped talking. The smoothness went away. What was left underneath it was younger and considerably less certain. "I don't know what you're Stop. Jackson's voice was still pleasant, still conversational, but it had acquired a quality, some specific frequency of absolute seriousness that made the word land like something physical. I'm going to be very clear with you right now, and I want you to pay attention to every single word, because I'm only going to say this once. He looked at Trent, then at Weston, then back at Trent. You are 17 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. I have no interest in destroying that. What I have interest in is my 15-year-old brother who has bruises on his body that should not be there, and I have interest in making sure that those bruises stop. Trent said nothing. He was breathing. That was about all he was doing. Now, Jackson continued, I know about your father. I know about the gym. I know about the school board. He tilted his head slightly. What I'm curious about is whether your father knows about this, specifically. What you've been doing to my brother. The extortion. The physical assault. The boot. He said the last word with a particular deliberateness that made Weston Cole shift his weight to his back foot like he was considering an exit. Trent's confidence was rebuilding itself. Brian could see it happening, the familiarity of the safety net reasserting itself. The recollection that his father had handled bigger problems than this, that money smoothed things, that people like this didn't actually have leverage, because leverage required something the system would acknowledge, and the system acknowledged his family, not strangers on motorcycles. My dad handles everything, Trent said, and he almost had the swagger back. Almost. You go ahead and make whatever calls you want. He'll talk to the principal, and this will be done by tomorrow morning. Jackson looked at him for a long moment, and then he smiled. It was a small smile, patient, and it did not reach his eyes. You're probably right, Jackson said. That's probably exactly what would happen. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. So I'm going to call your father right now, directly, before anyone talks to the principal, before any version of this story gets cleaned up or redirected. He looked at Trent. And I'm going to tell him exactly what his son has been doing with exactly the kind of detail that makes it very difficult to manage quietly. Because here's the thing about men like your father, Trent. He kept his voice completely level. They don't care about right and wrong, but they care intensely about exposure. And I'm very good at making things very difficult to contain. The silence in the hallway was absolute. Trent Harris looked at Jackson Sullivan, and his mouth opened, and nothing came out. Weston Cole had gone the color of old chalk. Brian Matthews stood very still and watched a 17-year-old boy realize for possibly the first time in his life that his safety net had a hole in it. Jackson looked down at his phone, looked back up. Do you want to tell me the number, or should I look it up myself? Because I will. It'll just take me about 4 minutes. He was almost gentle about it. Either way, I'm making the call. And Trent Harris, broad-shouldered, varsity-lettered, school board-connected Trent Harris, whose name was functionally a free pass at Oak Creek High School, sat down against the hallway wall. Not because Jackson told him to, not because anyone pushed him. He sat down because his legs went out from under him. And Weston Cole looked at him, and looked at Jackson, and his voice came out very small and very young when he said, Trent, we have to tell them. We have to just tell them everything. Brian looked at these two boys sitting in a school hallway, looking suddenly like exactly what they were. 17-year-old kids who had made choices that were about to cost them something real, possibly for the first time. And he felt something complicated. Not sympathy exactly, but the recognition that cruelty always looks different when consequence arrives. It always looks smaller, younger, more human. Not because it deserves absolution, but because it was always human to begin with, and that is the most disturbing part of all. Outside somewhere across the campus, Cody Sullivan was sitting on the bleachers at the edge of the backfield waiting. His water bottle was in his hands. His knee was probably aching. The autumn light was going gold and long across the grass, and the rest of the JV team was packing up around him talking about things that had nothing to do with any of this. He was 15 years old, and he was tired in a way that went a lot deeper than one Thursday afternoon, and he was waiting to find out if the thing he'd finally decided to trust was actually going to hold. Inside the building, His brother was making sure it would. Jackson made the call standing right there in that hallway, with Trent Harris still sitting against the wall, and Weston Cole standing beside him, looking like he was trying to remember how to breathe normally, and Brian Matthews 3 feet away, watching all of it with the particular alertness of a man who understood he was witnessing something that was going to matter for a long time. He didn't put the phone on speaker. He didn't need to. He dialed the number that Trent gave him without argument, without a second attempt at defiance, just recited it in a flat, defeated voice, like a kid who had finally run out of road. And he waited through 2 rings, and then a man picked up who sounded exactly like what he was, someone accustomed to being called, and accustomed to that call meaning something needed to be handled. "Harris," the voice said. Clipped. Businesslike. The voice of a man who answered his phone the way he ran everything else efficiently, with the implicit understanding that his time was worth more than most. "Mr. Harris," Jackson said. "My name is Jackson Sullivan. I'm calling about your son Trent, specifically about what he's been doing to my 15-year-old brother at Oak Creek High School for the past 7 weeks. He paused for exactly 1 beat. "I have medical documentation of the injuries. I have a school employee as a witness, and I have your son sitting in front of me right now who has not yet decided whether he wants to tell his own version of this story before I start telling mine." Another pause. "I'd like to give you the opportunity to be part of this conversation before it becomes a much larger one." The silence on the other end lasted 4 full seconds. Then Robert Harris said in a voice that had gone from businesslike to something considerably more careful, "Where are you right now?" "Oak Creek High School. East hallway near the gym." "Don't move," Harris said. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." He hung up. Jackson lowered the phone, looked at Trent. "Your father's coming," he said simply. Trent Harris looked up at him from the floor, and for the first time since this whole thing had started, Brian saw something on that boy's face that was not calculation, not entitlement, not the performed confidence of someone who had never had to be afraid of consequences. What he saw was just fear, clean and unadorned and completely age-appropriate. The fear of a 17-year-old boy who had just heard his father's voice go careful on the phone and understood on some instinctive level what that meant. "He's going to be," Trent started. "Angry," Jackson said. "Yeah, probably." He crouched down so he was at eye level with Trent, and his voice dropped, and what came out was not cruel. It was direct. "Here's what's going to happen when he gets here. You're going to tell him everything, not your version, everything. Because I was on that phone call and I heard his voice, and your father is not a stupid man, and the one thing that is going to make this significantly worse than it already is if he walks in here and you try to manage the story." He held the eye contact. "Do you understand me?" Trent nodded. A small, jerky motion, 17 years old and every inch of him showing it. "Good." Jackson stood back up, looked at Weston. "Same goes for you. When your parents get here." "My mom," Weston said very quietly. "My dad's he's not around." Something shifted in Jackson's face. Microscopic. Almost nothing. But Brian caught it a split second of something that wasn't sympathy exactly, but was adjacent to it. The recognition of a specific kind of situation that Jackson Sullivan knew something about from the inside. "Your mom then," he said. His voice had lost about 5 degrees of edge. "When she gets here, tell her the truth. All of it." Weston nodded. He looked like he might cry, and Brian had the complicated, disorienting experience of feeling sorry for him, which was not a feeling he'd expected to have today, about the boy who had helped put a boot print on Cody Sullivan's thigh. Jackson turned to Brian. "I need to go get Cody. He shouldn't be sitting out there alone." "I'll go," Brian said immediately. "You should stay here." Jackson considered this for about 1 second. "Yeah, okay." He glanced at the 2 boys on the floor and the wall. "They're not going anywhere." It was not a question. Neither Trent nor Weston said anything. Brian went to get Cody. He found him exactly where he'd expected, on the bleachers, water bottle in his hands, watching the last of the JV team disappear toward the locker room. The field was almost empty now. The light had gone that particular deep gold that means the day is running out. Cody heard Brian's footsteps and turned, and the question on his face was so naked and unguarded that it was almost painful to look at. "What happened?" Cody asked. "Your brother called your father," Brian said. "Harris Sr., he's on his way." Cody went very still. He called Robert Harris. He said the name like it was something he'd been afraid of for a long time. Jackson called Robert Harris directly. "Yes." "And he's coming here." "Yes." Cody stood up from the bleachers. His right leg gave slightly, and he caught himself and straightened, and Brian watched him do the mental math, all of it. Every calculation, running behind those exhausted eyes. Every possible outcome and consequence, and variable being processed at a speed that no 15-year-old should need. "Is Jackson okay?" Cody asked. And the fact that that was the question, not what's going to happen to me, not are they going to call the police, but is Jackson okay, said everything about this kid's internal compass that Brian needed to know. "He's fine. He's in the hallway with Trent and Weston. They're not fighting. Nobody's fighting." He paused. "Your brother is very good at not fighting while making it extremely clear that fighting is not something you want to do." Something crossed Cody's face that might, under different circumstances, have been a smile. "Yeah," he said. "He's always been like that." "Come on, let's go back inside." They walked back into the building together, and when they turned the corner into the east hallway, and Cody saw Jackson standing arms crossed, completely composed, with Trent and Weston still occupying their respective positions of deflated defeat, Cody's stride changed. Something in his walk shifted. Some load-bearing tension he'd been carrying in his shoulders redistributed itself, not all the way gone, but different. Lighter. By a fraction. By enough. Jackson looked at him. "You good?" "Yeah," Cody said. "Are you?" "Fine." A brief pause. "Harris Sr.'s coming. 20 minutes. Cody nodded. He didn't look at Trent. He looked at the wall beside Trent, which was probably all the dignity he could manage right now, and that was enough. They waited. It took 18 minutes. Brian knew because he watched the clock on the hallway wall with the focused attention of a man who needed something concrete to track. At the 16-minute mark, a door at the far end of the hallway opened, and Principal Gerald Morrison came through it with the particular energy of a man who has been told something is happening in his building and has arrived to contain it. Morrison was 61 years old, had been principal of Oak Creek High for 14 years, and had the specific bearing of someone who had built their professional identity on the idea that things at this school were handled quietly and well. He was not a corrupt man exactly. He was a managed man, someone who had been making small compromises for so long that he'd lost the ability to see where the compromises stopped and his actual values began. He came down the hallway and he took in the situation in one sweep. Trent and Weston against the wall. Jackson Sullivan standing with his arms crossed. Brian Matthews with Cody, and the specific quality of silence that meant something had already happened that he was too late to prevent. "What is going on here?" Morrison's voice was the voice of institutional authority, measured, controlled, designed to remind everyone present that this was his building, and these were his rules. Jackson looked at him with the patient attention of someone who was not remotely impressed by institutional authority. "Gerald Morrison," he said, as if confirming a name on a list. Morrison blinked. He had not expected to be the one identified. "I'm the principal of this school, yes. And you are?" "Jackson Sullivan, Cody Sullivan's older brother." He let that sit for one beat. "I've been on campus for about 40 minutes. In that time I've spoken with your coach, I've spoken with these two students, and I've spoken with Robert Harris, who is on his way here right now." He looked at Morrison with a steadiness that was almost disconcerting in its lack of hostility. "You've been principal here for 14 years. My brother has been a student here for 1 semester. In that 1 semester, he was extorted, beaten, and locked in rooms by these 2 boys, and at no point did your institution detect or address any of it." He paused. "I'd like to talk about what happens next." Morrison's face went through several things in rapid succession. Shock was in there briefly. Then the professional reflex toward management, toward getting control of the situation and redirecting it into channels he understood. Then something else, something harder to name, moved through him when he looked at Cody Sullivan standing next to Brian Matthews, and for just a moment, before the professional machinery reasserted itself, Gerald Morrison looked like a man who was genuinely, humanly horrified. "Cody," he said, quietly, "is what he's saying, is this accurate?" Cody looked at him. Really looked at him with the direct, unblinking assessment of a kid who had learned to read adults with great accuracy and had very precise, experience-based opinions about which ones were worth trusting. "Yes," he said. "All of it." Morrison closed his eyes for 1 second, opened them. "Brian, did you?" "I saw the injuries myself this morning," Brian said. "I should have caught it earlier. I didn't. I'm sorry for that." He said it plainly, without defensiveness, and the honesty of it seemed to catch Morrison off guard. The door at the end of the hallway opened again. Robert Harris came through it. He was the physical embodiment of money successfully converted into social status. Expensive suit. The kind of watch you notice without knowing why you notice it. The walk of someone who had not had to ask permission for anything in approximately 20 years. He came down that hallway with the energy of a man coming to solve a problem, and the first thing he did when he saw Trent was assess him with the rapid practical assessment of a man whose relationship with his son was organized primarily around liability management. "Trent." His voice was not warm. It was not cold exactly. It was businesslike in the way that was somehow worse than cold. "Stand up." Trent stood. Robert Harris looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he looked at Jackson. "Mr. Sullivan." A nod. The kind of nod that acknowledges you as a problem to be managed. "I understand there's a situation here that needs to be addressed." "There is," Jackson said. "Your son has been physically assaulting my 15-year-old brother and extorting money from him since September. There is documented medical evidence. There is a witness." He gestured toward Brian without looking away from Harris. "And your son is prepared to tell you all of it himself." Harris looked at Trent. A long look. The kind of look that contains a conversation that has nothing to do with anyone else in the room. "Is that true?" Trent's jaw worked. He looked at Jackson. He looked at the floor. He looked for just a moment like the child he actually was. And then he said very quietly, "Yeah, Dad, it's true." What happened on Robert Harris's face in the next 3 seconds was not what Brian had expected. He had been anticipating the machinery of wealth and influence cranking up the denial, the reframing, the protective maneuver. Instead, what he saw was something much simpler and much more devastating. Robert Harris looked at his son, and he looked genuinely, completely ashamed. Not strategically, not performatively. The real thing. Like something he'd suspected about himself for a long time had just been confirmed. He looked at Cody, and he said, "I'm sorry. I am genuinely sorry." He said it to a 15-year-old boy standing in a school hallway with bruises under his sleeve, and he said it without qualification or footnote. And Cody received it with the careful, practiced reserve of someone who understood that an apology and a solution were two different things. Then Robert Harris looked at his son again, and his voice went very quiet and very specific. "You're going to do exactly what Mr. Sullivan says. You understand me?" Trent nodded. He looked smaller than Brian had ever seen him look. He looked, in fact, exactly his age. "Good." Harris turned to Morrison. "Gerald, whatever needs to happen here, expulsion, formal documentation, whatever the process is, it happens. Completely. No mitigation." He looked at Morrison with the particular authority of a donor who has just switched from asset to liability management mode. "I want it done correctly." Morrison, who had been standing slightly to the side of all of this, with the expression of a man watching a controlled demolition of something he built, straightened, nodded, cleared his throat. "Yes, absolutely. We'll begin the formal process immediately." He looked at Brian, at Cody, at Jackson. "I want to say on behalf of this school that what happened to Cody should not have happened, and I intend to understand how it did." The hallway was quiet. Then Weston Cole, who had been so silent for so long that Brian had almost forgotten he was still there, said something that nobody expected. His voice was thick, like he'd been holding it together and had just reached the end of his capacity to do so. "I didn't want to," he said. To nobody specific. To the hallway. To some version of accountability that he'd been avoiding for 7 weeks. "I kept telling Trent to stop, and he kept... I didn't want to, but I didn't stop it either." His voice broke on the last word, clean and honest and terrible. "I didn't stop it." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Jackson Sullivan looked at Weston Cole with an expression that was not forgiveness and was not condemnation. It was something more complicated and more useful than either of those things. "Then you say that. To your mother, to the school, to whoever needs to hear it. You say exactly that, and you say it without making it about yourself. Can you do that?" Weston looked at him. His eyes were red. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." "Okay." Jackson looked at Cody. Something passed between them. Quick private, the specific communication of people who have their own language built from years of shared history. Then Jackson looked at Morrison. "I want the formal complaint filed tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight. I want documentation of every injury with timestamps. And I want to know what the oversight process looks like going forward, because my brother is going to continue attending this school, and I need to know that the system that failed him has a specific concrete plan for not failing him again." Morrison looked at him. And this time there was no management reflex in his expression. There was just a 61-year-old man looking at a situation he had allowed to exist through a combination of comfort deference and the particular blindness of someone who had invested too much in believing that his institution was running correctly. "Yes," he said. "All of that, yes." Robert Harris, to his credit, stayed. He sat across from Morrison in the principal's office, and he did not make calls or send texts or do any of the things that people with resources typically do when they're trying to contain something. He just sat there and let it be what it was. Brian did not know what to make of that entirely. He thought it probably didn't redeem anything. But it wasn't nothing either. Trent gave his statement first. Brian and Cody waited in the hallway while it happened, sitting on a bench outside Morrison's office, and for the first time in what felt like a very long time, there was nothing urgent happening. Just waiting. Just two people sitting in a school hallway, listening to the muffled sounds of a conversation happening on the other side of a closed door that was for the first time happening about the right things. Cody sat with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the floor, and after about 5 minutes of silence, he said without looking up, "He drove 4 hours." Brian looked at him. "Yeah." "He had work tomorrow. He never misses work." A pause. "He got fired from his last job because he missed 2 days when I had that thing with the foster placement, and he had to..." He stopped, started again. "He can't afford to lose this one." "He made a choice," Brian said. "He always makes that choice." Cody's voice was not resentful. It was something more complicated, the voice of someone who has been both saved and burdened by the same person's loyalty so many times that the two feelings have become inseparable. Every time. Doesn't matter what it costs him. He shows up. Brian didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would improve on that. "Coach." Cody's voice shifted, became smaller, more careful. "Can I ask you something?" "Yeah. Why didn't you just report it through the normal channels? You're a teacher. You're supposed to report it to the guidance counselor, the principal. That's the procedure." He wasn't being accusatory. He was genuinely asking. "Why did you call Jackson instead?" Brian thought about it. He thought about what he'd said to Cody that morning. "I know how this school works." He thought about Trent Harris's name on the gym wall. He thought about 14 years of Gerald Morrison making small compromises. He thought about the look on Cody's face when he'd said, "If you report it, they'll know I told," the absolute experience-forged certainty of someone who had no reason to trust the system. Because sometimes, Brian said, You look at a situation, and you can see very clearly that the right process and the right outcome are not going to arrive at the same destination. And when that happens, you have to decide what you're actually trying to accomplish. He paused. I was trying to get you safe, not to fill out the right forms. Cody absorbed this, nodded slowly. That's the most honest thing a teacher has ever said to me. I've been here 11 years, Brian said. I've had plenty of time to get tired of pretending. For the first time, not a partial, almost not a hairline fracture, but an actual, real, uncomplicated smile. Cody Sullivan smiled. It lasted about 4 seconds. It completely changed his face. It made him look 15. It made him look like what he was, and should have been this whole time a kid. Just a kid. Then the office door opened and Jackson came out, and the smile faded back into watchfulness, and Cody stood up off the bench. Statements filed, Jackson said. He looked tired, not defeated, just the particular tiredness of someone who has been running on controlled adrenaline and intensity for several hours and can feel the edge of it. Trent confirmed everything. Weston did too. Morrison is filing the formal expulsion paperwork tonight. Harris Sr. signed off on it. He looked at Cody. It's done. The official version is done. Cody stared at him. Just like that. Just like that. Jackson's voice was quiet. Money cuts both ways, Code. Robert Harris is more scared of this getting out than he is protective of his son right now. He'd rather be the father who handled it than the father who covered it up. He shrugged. I gave him the opportunity to be that. He took it. Cody was very still. And Trent? He's actually expelled, starting tomorrow. Weston's being suspended pending review. It's all in writing. Jackson looked at him steadily. You're not going to see them in this building again. I promise you that. Something happened in Cody then that was profound and quiet and entirely internal. Brian watched it from the outside, watched the boy stand in the hallway and receive for the first time in 7 weeks the information that the thing he'd been surviving was over. Not managed, not deferred. Over. And the way he received it was not with relief. Not immediately, because when you've been afraid for a long time, safe doesn't feel safe right away. It feels like a trick. It feels like something you're not allowed to trust. But Jackson was watching him with the specific patience of someone who understood exactly that dynamic. Who had probably felt it himself at some point in his own history. Who knew you couldn't push someone toward relief. You could only stay standing in front of them and let them arrive at it in their own time. Jackson, Cody said. His voice was very quiet. Almost nothing. Yeah. I'm sorry I didn't call you. Jackson looked at him for a long moment. And when he spoke, his voice had none of the controlled edge that had been carrying him through the last 3 hours. It had something older and simpler and much more tired. I know Code, he said. I know why you didn't. He stopped, took one breath. But I need you to understand something. Whatever I'm building, the job, the apartment, the whole thing, none of it means anything if you're out here getting hurt, and I don't know about it. He held the eye contact. You hear me? None of it. Cody's jaw was working. His eyes were bright. He nodded once, quick and tight, the nod of someone who is holding something large and fragile very carefully because they can't afford to drop it in a school hallway in front of their football coach. Okay, Cody said. Just that. Okay. And Jackson Sullivan, who had driven 4 hours and walked into a school and dismantled a system that had been running on silence for 17 years, all without raising his voice above conversational level, put his hand on the back of his brother's neck and squeezed once briefly and said, Let's go get something to eat. Brian Matthews watched them walk down the hallway together, the big man and the limping boy side by side, and he thought about systems and silence and the specific, irreplaceable quality of someone who refuses to let the people they love disappear into either one. He thought about what Cody had said. He's the kind of person who fixes things. Behind him, in Gerald Morrison's office, the sound of a printer running paperwork continued steadily into the evening. Documentation, formal process. The machine of consequence finally pointed in the right direction. It wasn't everything. Brian knew that. Systems don't fix themselves in one afternoon, and the conditions that had allowed this to happen were larger than one principal's compromises or one wealthy family's influence. Those things would take longer. Those things would require more than one conversation in a school hallway. But Cody Sullivan was walking out of that building with his brother, and the boys who had hurt him were not coming back, and the paperwork that would follow them was real and signed and witnessed. That was not nothing. In fact, on this particular Thursday evening in Millfield, Ohio, it was everything. They went to a diner called Patsy's 3 blocks from the school, because Jackson said he needed coffee and food in that order, and Cody said he didn't care where they went. And Brian, who had somehow ended up walking with them without anyone explicitly inviting him or explicitly not inviting him, said Patsy's had good pie, which was the most useful thing he could contribute to the conversation at that moment. It was a Thursday evening diner crowd. Retired couples, a few families, a table of nurses, still in scrubs, coming off a shift at the county hospital. The kind of place where the booths are slightly sticky, and the coffee comes in mugs that have been washed 10,000 times, and the pie is genuinely very good. Nobody looked at them twice when they came in. Or rather, a few people looked at Jackson twice, because Jackson was the kind of physical presence that generated second looks in most environments. But nobody said anything, and the waitress seated them in a corner booth with the efficient warmth of someone who has been doing this long enough to recognize when a table of people needs to be left relatively alone. Jackson ordered black coffee and a burger. Cody ordered the same thing and then looked slightly surprised at himself, like he'd just discovered he was hungry and hadn't known it until his body started making decisions independently. Brian ordered coffee and the apple pie because he'd mentioned it and now felt obligated to follow through. For a while, nobody said much. The kitchen sounds filled the space, oil plates, the rhythm of a short order operation, and Brian sat on his side of the booth, watching the two brothers exist in the same physical space for the first time in however long it had been. And he thought about the word family and what it actually means when you strip away all the institutional and legal definitions and get down to the bone of it. What it means, he thought, is this. Two people in a booth who are both pretending to read the laminated menu they already ordered from because they are both full of things that need to be said, and neither of them has figured out how to start. Jackson started. "How's the leg?" he said. Practical, direct, the way he said everything. "It's okay," Cody said. "That's not what I asked." A pause. "It hurts. It's been hurting for about 3 weeks. The cut inside is probably—" He stopped. "It's okay." Jackson looked at him over the rim of the coffee mug the waitress had just set down. "You're going to a doctor tomorrow morning. That's not negotiable." "I have school." "Doctor first, school second." He set the mug down. "I'll drive you." Cody blinked. "You're staying." "I took the week off work." The way Cody received that information, the small, careful stillness of it, the way he looked at the table for a second before looking back up, told Brian everything about how often this kind of thing had happened in this boy's life. Not often. Not often enough. The fact of someone rearranging their life to stay was still at 15 a novelty that hadn't lost its capacity to shock him. "You didn't have to do that," Cody said. "I know I didn't have to." Jackson's voice was level. "I wanted to. There's a difference." He looked at his brother steadily. "And we need to talk. Not tonight, you eat and you sleep. But tomorrow or the next day, we need to have an actual conversation about what's been happening. Not just this, all of it. How you've been since the last placement. What the situation at the house is like. All of it." Cody nodded slowly. He was picking at the edge of his paper placemat a small unconscious motion that Brian recognized as the physical manifestation of internal processing. "Okay," he said. "Yeah. Okay." Brian cleared his throat. "I should probably give you two some stay," Jackson said without looking at him. "You're part of this. You made the call. You kept him in your sight. That means something." He looked at Brian then, and what was in his eyes was straightforward and uncomplicated. "Thank you. I said it on the phone, but I want to say it to your face. Thank you." Brian absorbed that, nodded. "I should have seen it sooner. Maybe, But you saw it. Jackson wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. You'd be surprised how many people look directly at something like this and decide not to see it. Because seeing it means doing something about it, and doing something about it is inconvenient. His voice carried no accusation. It was just a statement of observed fact from someone who had seen the phenomenon enough times to have formed a very clear-eyed opinion of it. You saw it, and you did something. That's the whole game, man. That's literally all it is. The food arrived. Cody ate with the concentrated, efficient hunger of someone who had probably been running on inadequate fuel for weeks, and whose body had just gotten the signal that it was safe to want things again. Jackson watched him eat with the quiet, satisfied attention of someone for whom feeding another person is an act of care so fundamental it requires no commentary. Brian ate his pie. It was, in fact, very good. They were 20 minutes into the meal, and the conversation had moved into safer territory. Jackson asking about the football team. Cody explaining with surprising animation the specific tactical failures of their offensive line when Cody's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His whole body changed. What? Jackson said immediately. He had the specific attunement to Cody's physical signals of someone who had been reading that particular person for his entire life. Cody turned the phone so Jackson could see the screen. It was a text from a number Cody had saved as simply DF, 2 words. You talked. Jackson looked at it for 2 full seconds. His face did not change. Who is DF? Derek Fowler, Cody said. His voice had gone very quiet. He's a junior. He's he collects for Trent. When Trent doesn't want to do it himself, Derek does it. Brian leaned forward. There's a third person. There are more than 3, Cody said. He said it with a flatness that was somehow worse than any emotional delivery could have been. He has people. Derek and 2 others. They're not seniors. They're not as bad as Trent, but they're... He stopped. They know everything. Every time something happened, at least one of them was there. Jackson set his coffee mug down very carefully. And none of them were in that hallway today. No. And they know the meeting happened. Apparently, Cody's jaw was tight again. Derek probably heard from Weston. They're friends. Jackson looked at the text for another moment. Then he looked at Cody, with an expression that was controlled and deliberate, and contained something Brian could only describe as the specific fury of a person who has just discovered that the problem is larger than they were told, and is choosing very intentionally not to direct that fury at the person who didn't tell them. Why didn't you tell me about Derek? Jackson said. Not accusatory, asking. Cody looked at his hands. Because I told you about Trent and Weston, and I thought if that was handled, then Derek would just... He exhaled. I thought he'd back off. Without Trent, Derek sent this text 12 minutes after we left the building, Jackson said. Without Trent, Derek is apparently not backing off. I know. Cody's voice was small. I know. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. Jackson's voice was firm, but not harsh. You are 15. You are not responsible for managing the threat assessment here. That's not your job. He picked up his phone. I'm texting Brian Morrison's direct number. He needs to know about Derek Fowler and the others tonight, before school tomorrow. Morrison might not, Brian started. Morrison will, Jackson said. He looked at Brian with the certainty of a man who had spent 3 hours accurately reading every person in that building. Morrison is scared right now, scared in the right direction. He spent 14 years being comfortable and complicit, and something woke him up this afternoon, and he is not going to risk what just happened getting worse. He started typing. He'll pull Derek's file tonight. Brian's phone buzzed 30 seconds after Jackson sent the text. He looked at it. Morrison. The message said, I need Derek Fowler's name in writing. Send it to me, and I'll have his parents called before 9 a.m. He showed the screen to Jackson. Jackson looked at it, looked at Cody. See? Cody looked at the phone, then at his brother. And in that moment, Brian watched something happen in the boy's face that was quiet and significant, and would probably stay with him for a long time. The slow dawning recalibration of a person who has been operating on the assumption that the world is fixed and hostile and impenetrable, discovering through accumulated evidence that it is in fact neither fixed nor beyond pressure. He answered immediately, Cody said. Morrison never. He's been frightened into a better version of himself, Jackson said. It won't last forever, but it'll last long enough. He picked up his burger. Eat. We'll deal with Derek Fowler in the morning. Cody ate, but his eyes kept going to the phone, which he'd placed face down on the table, and Brian could see him running. The calculation was this text a threat, a warning, an attempt to intimidate him back into silence. And under that calculation, the older and more practiced one. Is it actually over, or does it just look over? Jackson, Cody said about 5 minutes later. Yeah, what if Derek... He stopped, reorganized. What if there are other kids, not just me, other kids who've been paying Trent? Derek probably doesn't stop just because Trent got expelled. The table went quiet. Brian set down his fork. Jackson looked at his brother for a long moment, and then he said, That's a really important thing you just said. It's true, though. I can't be the only... You're probably not, Jackson said. And if you're not, then what happened today doesn't just matter for you. It matters for whoever comes after you. He held the eye contact. Is there anyone specific you know about, anyone you've seen them target? Cody hesitated. That hesitation lasted about 4 seconds, which was 4 seconds of visible internal conflict, the pull between the self-protective instinct toward silence and something newer and less familiar. The pull toward using what had just happened as a door instead of just an exit. There's a kid in my English class, Cody said slowly. Marcus Teller. Not Marcus from the team, different Marcus. He's a freshman. He always has lunch money on Monday and nothing by Wednesday, and he told me once that he borrowed it from someone and couldn't pay it back. He paused. I didn't ask more questions. I should have. Jackson nodded slowly. Okay. Tomorrow, you tell Morrison about Marcus Teller. You tell him everything you just told me. He looked at his brother steadily. Can you do that? Yeah, Cody said. Yeah, I can. Good man. Jackson said it simply, without inflation, without the exaggerated approval that adults sometimes perform for teenagers. Just good man, factual, respectful, the kind of acknowledgement that actually lands because it doesn't try too hard. Cody straightened slightly in his seat. Unconsciously. The posture adjustment of someone who has just been told something that registered where it was supposed to register. Brian watched all of this and thought this is what it looks like when someone knows how to raise a person. Not perfectly, not without cost, but correctly in the ways that actually matter. They stayed at Patsy's for another 40 minutes. The conversation moved and shifted, sometimes heavy, sometimes lighter than Brian would have expected. Jackson told a story about a job site incident involving a forklift and a pallet of ceramic tiles that made Cody laugh for the first time Brian had heard a real laugh, the kind that doesn't perform itself. And the sound of it in that diner booth was the most significant thing that happened all evening. Then on the walk back to the school parking lot where both their vehicles were, Jackson said something that stopped Brian mid-step. I need to tell you something, Jackson said, to Cody. Not to Brian, but he said it in front of Brian without lowering his voice, which meant he'd decided Brian was safe enough to hear it. I've been working on something for the past 6 months, legally, with a family lawyer in Columbus. He stopped walking, turned to face his brother directly. I filed for custody code, legal guardianship. I have a stable income. I have an apartment with a second bedroom, and the lawyer says the case is strong. He paused. I was going to tell you at Christmas, when I had everything in place. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure. Cody had stopped walking. He was standing very still on the sidewalk outside the school parking lot with the autumn air moving around him, and his face was doing something Brian had no framework for, something so layered and complex and full that it almost didn't look like any single emotion at all. It looked like all of them. every one of them arriving at the same time. "You filed," Cody said, very quietly. "You already filed. 6 months ago. The hearing is in February." Jackson's voice was steady, giving him the facts because Cody needed facts right now, needed something solid to hold on to while the rest of it landed. "Mrs. Garza at the foster placement knows. She's supportive. She wrote a letter." He paused. "I was going to do this right. I wanted to do it right. I didn't want to tell you and then have something fall through." 6 months, Cody said again, like he was trying to get the math of it to feel real. "You've been doing this for 6 months and you didn't—" "I know. I didn't want to get your hopes up." Jackson's voice had a rough edge now, the first real fracture in his composure all day, and hearing it made Brian feel like he was intruding, except that Jackson had chosen to do this here in front of him, which meant he'd wanted a witness. Or maybe he'd needed one. Maybe saying it out loud in front of another person made it more real, made the commitment more visible, and therefore more irrevocable. "I know it wasn't fair to keep it from you. I'm telling you now." Cody looked at his brother. The look lasted a long time. Long enough that a car pulled out of the parking lot and its headlights swept across both of them and kept going. "February," Cody said. "February," Jackson confirmed. 4 months. And here was the thing that broke Brian Matthews open after a day that had already asked a great deal of him. Cody Sullivan, who had kept his face arranged into careful neutrality through beatings and extortion, and 7 weeks of absolute solitude, who had sat in a football coach's office and held himself together through the exposure of every terrible thing that had been done to him, who had eaten a burger in a diner, with the deliberate composure of someone who had learned that falling apart was a luxury. Cody Sullivan put both hands over his face and stood on a sidewalk in Millfield, Ohio, and cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silently, with his hands over his face and his shoulders drawn in the way people cry when they've spent a long time learning to make it take up as little space as possible. Jackson didn't say anything. He just stepped forward and put his arms around his brother and held him the way you hold someone when words are the wrong tool for the moment, when the only thing that works is the physical fact of another person choosing to be present and staying there. Brian looked at the parking lot, gave them time, gave them the courtesy of a few minutes that belonged entirely to them. When he looked back, they had separated. Cody was wiping his face with the back of his hand, with the efficient, slightly embarrassed motions of someone who is done with the crying portion of the evening and ready to move forward. Jackson was watching him with an expression that was careful and tired, and full of something Brian could only call love, the unglamorous, load-bearing, structurally necessary kind. "Sorry," Cody said to nobody in particular. "Don't be sorry," Jackson said. "I got your jacket." "Cody, don't be sorry." Jackson said it firmly. Then his voice softened. "You've been holding that for 7 weeks. You're allowed." A pause. Then Cody looked at him with red eyes and said with the specific directness of someone asking the question they most need answered, "Is it real? The custody thing. Is it actually going to happen?" "Yes," Jackson said. No hesitation, no qualification. "Yes, it's real. The lawyer is good. The case is solid, and I'm not going to stop until it's done." He looked at his brother with the same steady, absolute quality that had been carrying him through this entire day. "You are not going back to that foster house after February. I promise you that." Cody nodded. One slow, deliberate nod. The nod of someone accepting something they've wanted to believe for a long time and are finally deciding to let themselves believe. Brian cleared his throat. Both of them looked at him. "I don't mean to interrupt," he said, "but I want to say something, and then I'll let you go." He looked at Cody. "What you did today, what it took to sit in that office and tell the truth, and then to stay in that building while your brother handled what needed to be handled, and then to think about Marcus Teller in the middle of all of that." He stopped, collected it. "That took more courage than most adults I know would have. I want you to know I see that." Cody looked at him. His face was doing the complex thing again. "You called Jackson," he said. "I was trying not to make you do that." "I know," Brian said. "You were trying to protect everyone except yourself, which is a very admirable instinct and also a completely unsustainable one. So I'm glad I called." He paused. I'll be at practice on Monday. And I'll be talking to Morrison tomorrow morning before first period. And if anything feels wrong before then, you call me directly. My cell number is in the system. You can get it from the office." Cody nodded. "Okay, yeah." Brian looked at Jackson. "And you. If the custody process needs anything from this school documentation testimony from school staff, anything formal, I will do whatever I can to make sure it's in order." Jackson looked at him steadily. "I'll take you up on that," he said, seriously. They shook hands then, properly with the weight of the day in it. The handshake of two men who had spent an afternoon being on the same side of something and found the experience unexpectedly clarifying. Brian got in his car. He sat there for a moment before starting the engine, watching Jackson and Cody walk toward the Harley in the parking lot. Cody still slightly favoring the right leg. Jackson falling into the same pace without drawing attention to it. The two of them moving together with the specific physical ease of people who have known each other long enough that proximity is automatic. He watched Jackson get something from the saddlebag, an extra helmet, which he held out to Cody, who took it and turned it over in his hands, with an expression that suggested this was not the first time he'd ridden, and the memory of it was complicated and good. He watched Cody put on the helmet. He watched Jackson swing onto the bike and wait without impatience while Cody climbed on behind him. He watched Cody put his arms around his brother's waist. And then the bike started that sound, that particular thunderous declaration of movement, and they pulled out of the parking lot of Oak Creek High School into the October evening, and Brian Matthews watched them go until the taillight was gone. He sat in his car for another minute. He thought about Cody Sullivan arriving on that field 3 weeks ago, favoring a leg and arranging his face into careful neutrality, disappearing into the crowd with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that being invisible was the safest thing to be. He thought about Marcus Teller, who ate lunch alone on Wednesdays when the money ran out. He thought about Morrison's printer running paperwork into the evening. About Robert Harris sitting across from his son and looking ashamed. About Weston Cole's voice breaking when he said, "I didn't stop it." About the way truth, when it finally gets enough pressure applied to it from the right direction, doesn't crumble slowly. It collapses all at once like a wall that was always going to fall, just waiting for someone to decide that today was the day. He thought about the phone call, about dialing a number written on a piece of paper and hearing a voice on the other end cut through chaos like a blade, and that voice asking immediately, "Is he hurt?" Brian started his car. He had to be at the school at 7:15 tomorrow. He had a conversation with Morrison to have, and documentation to review, and probably a talk to give to the JV team about something he hadn't fully figured out how to say, yet some version of, "We see each other, we look out for each other, we are not in the business of looking away." He'd work on the wording tonight. He pulled out of the parking lot and turned toward home, and the October evening closed behind him, and somewhere on the road outside Millfield, a black Harley was carrying two brothers into whatever came next. It was not a perfect ending. Brian knew enough about how these things worked to know that February was 4 months away, and 4 months was a long time. And Derek Fowler still had a phone, and Marcus Teller still existed, and the machinery of consequence, even pointed in the right direction, grinds slowly. He knew that Cody Sullivan was going to wake up tomorrow morning in a foster house that wasn't home, with a leg that still hurt, and go back to a school that had failed him, and was now trying belatedly to be something different. He knew all of that. But he also knew that Cody Sullivan had put his arms around his brother's waist and held on, and that Jackson Sullivan had driven 4 hours without being asked and taken a week off work and filed for custody 6 months ago and kept it quiet so the hope wouldn't turn into hurt before it was ready to be real. And he knew that sometimes, not always, not automatically, but sometimes when the right person makes the right call at the right moment, the thing that was going to break, someone doesn't break them. It breaks the wall that was keeping help out instead. That was not nothing. On a Thursday night in October, in a town that had spent a long time being very good at looking the other way, it was in fact the whole thing. Brian was at the school by 7, not 7:15. 7. He'd barely slept. Not from anxiety exactly, more from the particular alertness of someone whose brain had decided that last night was too important to fully process in the dark, and had spent the hours between midnight and 5:30 running the whole thing on a continuous loop. The phone call. The hallway. Trent against the wall. Jackson's hand on the back of Cody's head. The text from D.F. Marcus Teller, who had lunch money on Monday and nothing by Wednesday. He got to Morrison's office before Morrison did, which had never happened in 11 years. And he stood in the hallway, outside the closed door, and drank terrible vending machine coffee, and waited. And when Morrison came around the corner at 7:12 and saw Brian standing there, the principal stopped walking for just a moment, a half-second recalibration, and then kept coming with the expression of a man who had also not slept well, and had also spent the night running a loop. "Brian," Morrison said. "Gerald." Brian had never called him Gerald before. They had always been Coach Matthews and Principal Morrison, the comfortable professional distance of people who work in the same building and have carefully never needed each other for anything important. That distance was gone now. Last night had taken it. "We need to talk about Derek Fowler, and I need to know what the formal complaint documentation looks like before first period." Morrison unlocked his office door. "Come in," he said. "I've got coffee, real coffee." They sat across from each other at Morrison's desk, and Morrison pulled up files on his computer. And for the next 45 minutes, they talked with the specificity and urgency of two people who understand that they are building something that needs to hold weight. Morrison had called Derek Fowler's parents the night before at 9:30. And the conversation had apparently been productive in the way that conversations are productive when the parents involved are confronted with documentation they cannot argue with, and the knowledge that two other families had already signed off on formal statements. Derek Fowler would be in Morrison's office at 8:15. His parents were coming with him. "And Marcus Teller," Brian said. "Freshman, English class with Cody Sullivan. I need you to pull his file and have someone check in with him today." Morrison wrote the name down. "You think he's been targeted by the same group?" "I think it's possible." "Cody thinks it's possible. That's enough for me." Morrison looked at him over the desk. "Brian, I want to say something, and I need you to let me say it without you being polite about it." He paused. "I failed this kid. I failed Cody Sullivan. And I failed him because I made it very easy for myself not to see what was happening. And I made it easy because seeing it would have required me to do something about it, and doing something about it would have been complicated." He said it plainly, not as a performance of accountability, as a statement of fact that he had clearly arrived at somewhere around 2 in the morning and decided to carry in the open rather than bury. "I've been principal here for 14 years, and I've told myself that this school is well run, and that I know what's happening in it. Last night showed me that I was wrong about that in a significant way." Brian looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "I wasn't seeing it either. For 2 weeks I watched that kid limp and told myself it was a sports injury. You called the brother. Eventually. Eventually is what we had," Morrison said. "And eventually turned out to be enough. But I don't want to run a school where eventually is the best we can do." He straightened. "I'm bringing in an outside review of our reporting and response processes. Not because the district is requiring it, because it needs to happen." He paused. "I thought you should know." Brian looked at him for a moment. Thought about 11 years of this building and the comfortable equilibrium of it, the way things had always just run in their established channels, and how much easier it was to work inside a system than to interrogate whether the system was actually serving the people it was built to serve. "Good," he said. "That's good, Gerald." They finished the coffee, they went over the documentation, and at 8:05, Brian's phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't have saved. It said, "Cody's at the doctor. Leg needs imaging but nothing broken. He slept okay. J." Brian read it twice. Felt something in his chest release that he hadn't fully noticed was held. He typed back, "Thanks for letting me know. Derek Fowler is in with Morrison at 8:15. Call me if you need anything today." The response came back in under a minute. "Already know about Fowler. I called Morrison myself at 6 a.m. Brian stared at that for a second. Then he laughed a short, genuine, slightly disbelieving laugh that bounced around his empty classroom and came back to him sounding like relief. Of course he had. Of course Jackson Sullivan had been on the phone with the principal at 6 in the morning while Brian was still drinking vending machine coffee in a hallway. The man did not wait for systems to catch up to him. He met them where they needed to be. At 8:15, Derek Fowler came into the school with both parents and the specific energy of a 17-year-old who has spent the night being confronted by adults and has arrived on the other side of that experience hollow and deflated and without any of the performance that usually held him together. He was not Trent Harris. He didn't have Trent's particular brand of inherited confidence. What he had was the uglier and more ordinary quality of someone who had made himself useful to a person with power and had confused that usefulness for protection. Brian heard about what happened in Morrison's office from Morrison himself afterward. Derek Fowler, it turned out, had been operating as the intermediary for a network that extended beyond Trent and Weston. 3 additional students, all of them peripheral. All of them enlisted in the same basic economy of intimidation that Trent had been running since the beginning of the school year. Derek gave all of their names. Not heroically, not with any particular moment of moral awakening. He gave them because his father was sitting next to him, and his father had made it very clear before they walked through the door that cooperation was the only acceptable currency in this situation. The names went into the documentation. The documentation went into the system. And the system finally aimed correctly, and under the specific pressure of accountability that had been applied to it the night before, actually functioned. Marcus Teller was pulled aside by the school counselor at 10:30. Brian found out about that through Marcus from the team, who found out through the specific osmosis of high school information networks, and who reported it to Brian during passing period, with the wide-eyed solemnity of someone who was slowly understanding that something real and significant had happened in his school and was still happening. "Coach," Marcus said, falling into step beside him, "is it true that Trent Harris and Weston Cole got expelled? Like actually expelled. Not suspended, actually expelled." "Word travels fast," Brian said. "Coach, Trent's dad literally has his name on the gym." "I know. So how did—" Marcus stopped walking, looked at Brian with the sudden complete attention of a kid whose brain has just made a connection. "Cody's brother," he said. "That's how." Brian looked at him, said nothing, which was confirmation enough. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he said with the specific reverence that 14-year-old boys reserve for things that have genuinely impressed them, "That is the most insane thing I've ever heard." A pause. "Is Cody okay?" "He's going to be," Brian said. And he meant it. Cody came back to school that afternoon. Not in the morning. Jackson had kept him at the medical center through late morning, waiting for the imaging results, which showed a deep muscle contusion that had been aggravated into a partial strain by 7 weeks of practice on an injury that should have had him in a walking boot 3 weeks ago. The doctor gave him a brace pain medication and explicit instructions to stay off the leg for 2 weeks. Jackson relayed all of this in a series of texts to Brian with the factual efficiency of a man who understood that information needed to move to the right people without delay. Cody arrived at school at 12:40 just before 6th period, and Brian was in the hallway near the main entrance when he came through the door. He was wearing the brace over his jeans, visible and unavoidable. And for a split second, Brian saw something cross the boy's face at the exposure of it. The old reflex toward hiding, toward managing what was visible, toward arranging everything so that the evidence of what had happened to him wouldn't be the first thing people saw. And then something else happened. Cody straightened. Not dramatically, not for performance. He just straightened, lifted his chin a fraction. Walked into Oak Creek High School at 12:40 on a Friday afternoon with a visible leg brace and his head up, and let it be what it was. Brian thought, there it is. There's the moment it changes direction. He fell into step beside Cody and said, "How's the leg?" "Brace is annoying," Cody said. "Doctor said 2 weeks. Jackson wants me to do 3. A beat. "Jackson is probably right." "Probably," Brian agreed. "Morrison wants to see you after 6th period." Just to check in, nothing formal. He wants you to know what's been done. Cody nodded. Derek. Suspended pending expulsion review. The other 3 got disciplinary holds while the paperwork processes. They're not on campus. Cody absorbed this as he walked. His stride was altered by the brace, but more stable. The compensating hitch in his hip was gone now that he wasn't navigating raw pain with nothing to support it. And Marcus Teller. Counselor met with him this morning. He's talking. Cody let out a breath. Just one, long and deliberate. Good, he said. That's good. They walked in silence for a moment. The school moved around them. Classes shifting lockers, voices, the normal Friday afternoon loosening of energy as the week wound down, and Brian noticed something different in how the hallway received Cody today. Not dramatic. Not the kind of thing you could point to specifically, but present. The invisible kid who had learned to take up no space was taking up space now, and the environment was registering it in small ways. A couple of sophomores he'd never seen acknowledge Cody before nodded at him as they passed. A girl in Cody's year looked at him and then quickly looked away in the specific manner of someone who has information they are still metabolizing. Word had traveled. Of course it had. This was a high school. Word always traveled. People know, Cody said. It wasn't a question. Some version of it, Brian said carefully. Cody considered this. Is it bad? What they think happened. From what I can tell, Brian said, the version circulating mostly involves your brother arriving on a motorcycle and dismantling the social order. Marcus. My Marcus described it to 3 different people this morning as the most insane thing that's ever happened at this school, which is probably some form of compliment. Something pulled at the corner of Cody's mouth. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to it. Jackson would hate that, he said. He hates being... He stopped. He hates it when it becomes a thing. What does he prefer? Getting it done and leaving, Cody said simply. He always says the people who need to know what happened already know. Everyone else is just entertainment. Brian thought about that. About a man who drove 4 hours and dismantled a corrupt social system and filed for custody 6 months in advance and called the principal at 6 in the morning, and who would have given the choice, prefer that none of it be a story. Who would prefer that it was just a thing that needed doing, that got done, that allowed someone to stop being hurt. No audience required. He thought that is in fact the most significant kind of courage. The kind that doesn't need to be witnessed to be real. 6th period ended. Cody went to see Morrison. Brian waited outside the office again, this time with better coffee from the teacher's lounge, and 20 minutes later, Cody came out with an expression that was not the guarded neutrality Brian had spent the week learning to read. It was something quieter and more settled. Something that looked like a person who has been told clearly and specifically what has happened on their behalf and has decided to let themselves believe it. He apologized, Cody said. He seemed slightly stunned by this. Morrison, he apologized to me, personally. He looked at me and said, I failed you and I'm sorry and I'm going to do better. Brian nodded slowly. Good. I didn't know what to say. What did you say? Cody thought about it. I said okay. A pause. Is that bad? No, Brian said. That's honest. You're not required to forgive anyone on a timeline that suits them. Okay is a perfectly complete answer. Cody looked at him. Jackson says the same thing. Your brother is a smart man. They walked out of the building together into the Friday afternoon, and Jackson was there leaning against the Harley in the front lot, same position as yesterday, same crossed arms, same methodical sweep of his eyes across the campus when they came through the door. Except today something in his posture was different, less load-bearing, less the stance of a man who has arrived to handle a crisis, and more the stance of a man who is simply waiting for someone he came to get. He looked at Cody's leg brace. Keeping it on. Doctor's orders, Cody said. 3 weeks, Jackson said. Doctor said 2. I said 3. He said it without heat. The comfortable authority of someone who has earned the right to an opinion on the subject of this particular person's well-being. Cody almost rolled his eyes. Didn't quite. Fine. 3 weeks. Jackson looked at Brian. How'd it go today? Fowler is out. The others are on disciplinary hold. Morrison is starting an outside review of the school's reporting processes. And Marcus Teller talked to the counselor this morning. Brian paused. I'd say it went well. Jackson nodded. Good. He looked back at Cody. Something moved in his face. Something that had been held back all day through the medical center and the texts and the 6 a.m. phone call to Morrison. Something that the forward momentum of handling things had kept in check. You doing okay? Actually, okay, not, Cody looked at his brother. He looked at him for a long moment, the way you look at someone when you're deciding to stop using the abbreviated version of the truth and give them the real one. I'm scared, he said. Still. Not of Trent, not of them, just of it not sticking. Of February not happening. Of going back to... He stopped. Looked at the ground. Looked back up. I know you said it's real. I believe you. But I'm still scared it won't be. Jackson let that sit. He didn't rush past it, didn't reassure immediately, didn't perform comfort. He just let the thing Cody had said exist in the air between them for a moment, because it deserved to exist there, deserved to be heard without being immediately resolved. Then he said, Yeah, I know. That's the right thing to be scared of. He pushed off the bike, stood in front of his brother with the full weight of his presence, which was considerable. So here's what we're going to do. Tonight we're going to my motel room and we're going to order bad pizza and watch whatever game is on, and you are not going to think about February. Tomorrow morning, I have a call with the lawyer at 9. You're going to be on that call with me. You're going to hear everything, the timeline, the hearing date, the documentation, all of it. Directly from her, not from me. He paused. Because you deserve to hear it from the source. Not filtered, not managed. The actual thing. Cody stared at him. You're putting me on the call with the lawyer. Yes. You've never... He stopped. You always handle that stuff separately. You never... I know. Jackson's voice was quiet. I was trying to protect you from the hoping. In case it didn't work out. He held the eye contact. But I think I got that wrong. I think you needed to be inside it, not outside it. You needed to know it was happening, not just be told after. He paused. So tomorrow you're on the call. You ask whatever you want. She's good, she'll answer you straight. For the second time in 2 days, Cody Sullivan's face did the complex, layered thing. The thing that wasn't any single emotion, but all of them arriving at once. Except today, underneath all the complexity, something else was present that hadn't been there before. Something cleaner. Something that looked, Brian thought, very much like the beginning of trust. Not blind trust, not the naive version, the earned kind, the kind built from evidence, from watching someone show up repeatedly and specifically, and without requiring anything in return. Okay, Cody said. His voice was thick. He cleared his throat. Okay. What time? 9 a.m. Don't be late. I'm never late. You were late to practice twice in October. That was... Cody stopped. A breath. That was because I was trying to avoid the east parking lot at certain times. The words landed quietly. Jackson absorbed them with a stillness that said he understood exactly what that meant and what it cost to have said it so plainly. Yeah, he said. I know. That's not going to be a problem anymore. He put his hand briefly on Cody's shoulder, squeezed once. Let's go. He turned to Brian, extended his hand. Brian took it and they shook, and this time the handshake had a different quality than the one the night before, less urgent, less transactional. More like the kind of handshake you give someone when you've been through something with them and are marking the fact of it. Brian Matthews, Jackson said. If this school does what it's supposed to do going forward, if the process sticks, if Morrison's review actually changes something, if other kids stop getting hurt in this building. He paused. That starts with you picking up a phone last Thursday and making a call you didn't have to make. Brian looked at him. I had to make it, he said. There was never really a version where I didn't. Something in Jackson's face shifted, a recognition. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know what that's like." They looked at each other for a moment, two men who had each in their own way spent their lives learning the cost of action and the higher cost of inaction, and who had both on a Thursday in October chosen correctly. Then Jackson turned back to his brother. "You need anything from inside?" "No," Cody said. "I've got everything." He looked back at the school building when he said it. Just once. A quick, clean look, not nostalgic, not afraid, not the look of someone who had been defeated by a place. The look of someone who had walked through something real inside those walls and come out the other side, changed in ways that were going to take time to fully understand, but changed, and still standing and going somewhere better. The February hearing was held on a Tuesday. Brian found out it had happened from a text. A single text, no words, just a photograph. Two people in a lawyer's office in Columbus, Ohio. Jackson Sullivan in a collared shirt. Brian had never seen him wear slightly uncomfortable in the way large men are slightly uncomfortable in formal settings, but smiling. And Cody Sullivan beside him, 15 years old, holding a piece of paper, looking directly at the camera, with an expression so open and unguarded and completely without its careful neutral armor, that he looked like a different person. Or maybe Brian thought maybe he looked like the person he had always been underneath everything that had been piled on top of him. He texted back. "Congratulations." Jackson texted back. "He starts at the new school Monday, closer to the apartment." He picked it himself. Brian looked at that for a while. He picked it himself. 4 words that contained a world, the specific, irreplaceable world of a kid who had spent a significant portion of his life having things decided for him, finally being handed a decision and making it. He thought about that Thursday in October. The limp he'd almost not noticed. The handprint bruise he'd almost not seen. The piece of paper with a phone number on it that had sat on his desk for 20 minutes while he decided whether to dial it. He thought about what Jackson had said. The people who need to know what happened already know. He thought about Cody Sullivan walking into Oak Creek High School on a Friday afternoon, with his head up and his leg in a brace, and the careful neutral armor finally starting piece by piece to come off. He thought about Marcus Teller, who had talked to the counselor and who was still at Oak Creek, and who had eaten lunch on 3 consecutive Wednesdays this month without the money running out. He thought about Morrison's external review, which had been completed in December and had resulted in a revised mandatory reporting protocol that was genuinely more specific and more enforceable than what had existed before. Not perfect, not enough on its own, but real and documented and in place. He thought about Weston Cole, who had told the truth, and who had emailed Brian in January, an awkward, unpracticed email, clearly written and rewritten several times, to ask if there was any way to write a letter to Cody, to apologize. Not to be forgiven, the email was careful to specify that in the specific, slightly stilted language of someone who had been coached on this by a therapist. Just to say the thing that needed to be said. Brian had forwarded that email to Jackson and let them decide. He didn't know what happened after that. That part wasn't his to know. He thought about what it means to intervene. Not the dramatic version, not the story version, where someone arrives and everything resolves cleanly and the credits roll. The real version. The version where you make a call you're not sure about, and then you keep showing up, and then someone else keeps showing up, and then the systems that were failing start incrementally and imperfectly to function better because the people inside them woke up to what they were actually for. He thought about a 15-year-old boy who had learned to be invisible and was now, as of a Tuesday in February, going home. Not back to the foster placement. Not back to anywhere he'd been before. Home. The specific, chosen, legally established home of someone who had filed the paperwork 6 months in advance and waited and built and worked and driven 4 hours without being asked and called the principal at 6 in the morning and stood in a school hallway with his arms crossed and refused, absolutely refused, to let his brother disappear into the silence that had been trying to swallow him. Brian Matthews sat in his office, the one that smelled permanently of whiteboard marker and old coffee, the one with the world's okayest coach mug and the play diagrams, and he looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he set his phone down, picked up his clipboard, stood up. Practice started in 20 minutes. There were 30 kids on that field who needed a coach who was paying attention, and he intended to be exactly that. Not perfectly. Not without the inevitable gaps and failures that come with doing anything real over a long period of time. But with his eyes open and his phone charged, and the absolute hard-won understanding that seeing something and doing something are two halves of the same obligation, and that the distance between them is exactly where kids fall through. He was not going to let another kid fall through. He walked out of his office into the gym through the side door and onto the field. The October air was gone. It was February now, cold and clean, the field half frozen. The team already assembled and doing warm-ups with the controlled energy of boys who had spent the winter months in conditioning and were ready finally for spring practice to start. Marcus, his Marcus center position, situational awareness of a golden retriever and a heart the size of the state, saw him coming and waved with both arms like Brian had been gone for a month rather than 30 seconds. "Coach, we've been waiting." Brian raised his clipboard. "Let's go," he said. "From the top." They ran. Somewhere in Columbus, in an apartment with a second bedroom and a window that got morning light, a 15-year-old boy was unpacking a box. His brother was in the kitchen making coffee, and the apartment was small and imperfect, and full of the specific productive noise of two people figuring out how to share a space that belongs to both of them, and Cody Sullivan put a photograph on the windowsill. Nothing special. Just the two of them taken by a lawyer with a cell phone in a Columbus office on a Tuesday in February. And he stood back and looked at it for a moment. Then he went to help with the boxes. He was home. And this time no one was taking that from him.